Welcome to the High Value Men Podcast, the show dedicated to helping men to unlock their potential, become the best version of themselves, and walk confidently in their purpose. Today, I'm excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Richelle Whittaker. She's an educational psychologist, speaker, and the author of Strong Men Start Here, a mom's roadmap to raising confident and emotionally whole sons. With over 15 years of experience, Rochelle is trusted expert in equipping parents to foster resilience, emotional intelligence, and self-confidence in their children. Today, we are going to explore her work, insights, and actionable strategies for building emotional strength and confidence, not just in our kids, but in ourselves. So let's dive in. Rochelle, I'm excited to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. Excited for this conversation.
Awesome, awesome. So you are the author of the book, right? S-
Yes.
Strong Men Start Here, right? Tell us a little bit about your story. What inspired you to write this book?
Long story, so I'll try to keep it short. But I've had a passion for boys. I feel like it's just part of my DNA. But if I had to pinpoint a specific time or person, it would be my cousin. We were raised together. He's a few years younger than I am. And to start off, when we were young, he would do all the things. He would constantly get in trouble. He would get in trouble, and then he would go back to it. And so what I later learned was that he had ADHD and it was pretty severe. And so my aunt just didn't have a lot of resources because back during that time, it just wasn't something that was talked about, ADHD and how to treat it and those things. She did do some different treatments. They just didn't work to her satisfaction, and then she was kind of limited. In addition to that, they ended up moving where we live. When I say we, I say myself and my parents, my family, from the state that they were in. They moved here, and at the time, she wanted to, make her way, and so she had to live in a transitional living facility until the apartments were ready. But my cousin, because he was 16 at the time, he couldn't go with her and his sisters, because that age was not at it was for because it was women and children. He was too old. And so for whatever reason, I ended up having to drop him off at this place for young boys, uh teenage boys. And it really broke my heart. And I said, whenever I get the when I get old enough, um this won't happen again. This would not happen again. And so from that point on, I have just had a heart and a desire to, I guess in a sense, save boys. And so yeah, that's kind of where it started. And it's been that's been my life's work since then. I was 19 at the time.
Wow, I love that. I find that sometimes our experience are a moment in time and that lead us to our purpose and the work that we want to do in life.
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely.
So raising boys, right? It comes with its own set of challenges, right? What are some of the biggest challenges that you see parents face today?
So interestingly enough, so I didn't say this. So it started off with my cousin, and then God would see fit to give me sons, and so that that's a whole nother part. So I have been working with boys and families for a long time, and then I have my own son. So when you ask me about raising sons can be challenging, and talking about that, and I think oftentimes as a woman, I'm not I don't understand or know all the nuances of how boys operate and the kinds of things they think about. So when you talk about parents having challenges in terms of raising for a mom raising a son, I think you have to be very intentional about what kind of man you want him to be, but you have to reverse engineer that to when you start off, right? So when he's a baby, thinking about that vision and then keeping that in alignment with how you raise him. And so some of the challenges that I find, my both of my sons are very one more so than the other, very high spirited. When I say high spirited, I mean um and this is probably more so when they were younger, but just their level of energy is different, I would say, than girls typically. That's not all the time, but just, they're always moving, always doing something. um and so, that can be challenging because it's just different from what how I'm used to operating. Um so that I would say that's one challenge, just because it's different from, how I operate, but even how they process feelings and emotions, and giving them the opportunity to do things how they do it and not make it about how I feel like it should be, right? So women tend to be more expressive and talkative, and one of my sons is pretty expressive, but the other one, I can ask him a question and it might just take him, especially if it has something to do with how he feels or what he's thinking, it just may take him a while to respond. And that's different than how I would naturally respond. It's more along the lines of how my husband responds. And so it's giving him the space and the opportunity to process what I'm asking. And then it may not be in that moment. Most of the time it's not. But to come back, giving him that space to process and then come back and to respond to the question, or even helping him have the language to be able to express, what he's feeling or thinking. So that's long story, but those are some of the challenges.
Yeah, I love that, right? I'm a father, right? I just became a father 2 years ago, my son.
Oh.
And yeah, so one of the challenge, well, one of my fear was, right, really, okay, not passing on some of my own traumas, right?
Mm,
And really studying the work that I do, right, it's really open your eyes to trauma and how it's created, right, so to speak, right? And so, okay, how am I, like, I was scared to have a son, right? Because scared of that, right? Because I want to protect him,
mm-hmm,
but at the same time, I want him to grow up to be a man, right? So trying to balance all of that,
mm,
right? It's sometimes challenging, right? And the protective side of you comes out, kicks in sometimes, right? So sometimes I see him doing stuff that are dangerous, and I'm saying, no, I have to leave him, let him do that. He's not a girl child.
mm-hmm.
You get what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
raising boys, yeah, it's sometimes challenging because you don't want to pass on society's views and
right.
way. You get what I'm saying? But at the same time, you want him to be that strong, emotionally healthy child, right?
Yes.
And so, like, teaching emotions and how to express emotions, that is something that it is important, because as men, we are taught not to express our emotions,
Mm,
that it's a sign of weakness, right?
yes.
So, how do you, like, teach boys, right, to be boys, right, to be men, so to speak, but at the same time being able to express themselves emotionally.
So I think it starts early. I think it starts with giving them the language. When I say language, I mean giving them the different types of emotions that you feel. So generally speaking, people know about anger, they know about sadness, they know about happiness. Um, and then they know about frustration and irritation, but there's so many more emotions that come. And so helping them to have the language, the words, to be able to know, okay, I feel these things, but I also feel some other things. And so knowing what those things are. So I think first it starts with giving them the language and making them aware of the language, and then helping them to know when to express it, right? So, one of the things that my husband has had to tell me is, yes, we want them to be able to express their emotions, but not everywhere. right? Because you don't want, because there's a code amongst boys, so to speak, that if they start, expressing their emotions in certain places, that then those boys will be like, oh, you're doing this or you're doing that, and we're not gonna hang out with you or whatever. So I think it's important for them to have the language to be aware of how they're feeling, when they're feeling it, and also to know when to express it so that they have a safe space, so they feel comfortable, and it's okay. Because you don't want, I don't want my sons to express their emotions and then to be ridiculed for it. And then that means that they won't in turn express. So it's helping them to know what their emotions are, um, that it's okay to have these emotions, but also helping them to know, okay, you want to express this in a safe space so that you're not ridiculed, so that people aren't taunting you, and so that you're not, um, in effect, not deciding not to express because of that. So it's challenging.
Yeah, it is, right? And yeah, there are codes, right? And so it's important to know when to balance it.
Hmm.
Um, so it basically masculinity, right? Stereotypes, it can really shape how boys see themselves, right? How can mothers or even parents, right, help their sons to push past those stereotypes? Because it's out there, right? And they're hearing it. So how can parents teach their son to push past it?
I think one of the things that parents have to do is unravel their own assumptions about boys, right? Because if you don't sit down and kind of have conversations with yourself about what your beliefs about boys are, you will inevitably push that same societal view and belief onto them. And so it's important for you to unravel the assumptions that you may hold about boys and reframe it. So, you know, a lot of times people say, okay, well, boys, boys aren't supposed to cry. Boys aren't supposed to do this. Boys show up like this. And so it's really sitting down with yourself and saying, where did this come from? Where do these beliefs come from? Do I believe what they're saying? Even sometimes dealing with your own trauma, because I've seen it where a lot of moms have had bad experiences with men, with boys growing up, and in subconsciously they end up putting that onto their sons, not on purpose, but like I said, subconsciously. So I think one of the things, the first thing that parents have to do is to unravel their own assumptions, their own beliefs, their own stereotypes, their own prejudice about boys, and what raising a emotionally whole and strong boy into a man, what that looks like for them. Because if you can't answer those questions, and that's why I always say you have to start with the end in mind. Because if you can, if you don't know the answers to those questions, you will inevitably push them into the same stereotypical perspective. I'm sorry, perspective as society. And so you really have to start with unraveling your own assumptions.
Yeah, I totally agree, right? Because sometimes, like when my son start crying, like when he fell down and he started crying, the stereotype in me want to tell him, hey, you are a boy, get up, stop crying, brush yourself off, right? Um, but at the same time, so I had I have to catch myself sometimes and say, hey, so it's kind of a knowing how to balance it,
Hmm.
right? Yes, it's hurting, and yes, boys supposed to be tough. Well, that's what we are taught, right? That should be tough, right? And I so learning how to balance that can be a challenge,
Yes.
right? And I totally agree that we have to look at our own stereotype, right? Our own beliefs and not pass it on to our boys, right? So how can mothers specifically, right, help teach their boys to be emotionally strong and at the same time being boys?
So kind of going back to what I was saying before is giving them the language, telling them that it's okay to, express their feelings and emotions, and then giving them the space, creating a safe space for their sons to be able to do that, right? So, I mean, I think that's probably true of all of us, right? You're not going to just totally express all of your emotions while you're at work or, as a kid growing up on the playground. And so it's creating that safe space, with mom to be able to, say I'm sad or, say I'm angry, and then giving them the tools on what to do. So I tell my sons, anger is a natural emotion. You can be angry, but you can't act on that anger, right? So these are some things that you can do. You can go, punch a pillow. You can go outside and scream. You can do, you have a punching bag in your room. You can go punch that, but you can't punch the door, right? You can't, scream at us or scream at your brother. Though, so giving them the tools to be able to when they feel certain emotions, how do they manage it, how do they cope with it. So I think that's important, but I also think it's important in creating a safe space and not being dismissive of feelings. And so what I've seen in my work oftentimes is um a mom may bring, when I was providing therapy, a mom would bring her son in, and maybe for a number of reasons, we would have one visit, and mom would be like, "Okay, he's good." And the only reason why she's bringing him is because the school or somebody has said something to the degree like he needs help. And so I think again it goes back to what we believe about boys, and sometimes we can be dismissive of them having feelings of sadness or agitation or not belonging. And so not taking the time to really explore that and giving them the space to express and talk to you about, some of the deeper things that are causing them to feel this way. I think those are some things that moms can do. I think the biggest thing is open communication and creating that safe space.
I love that, right? So boys, when they go out into the wider society, right? Peer pressure can really be tough on them, right? So how can parents really prepare their sons to deal with peer pressure?
I think that having conversations, so communication is key. My sons and I have what I call car conversations in the morning. And so we have a 5-minute devotional. And what that devotional does is it opens up conversations about things that they're experiencing at school. And so that kind of communication helps them to be able to talk about some of the things that they're experiencing and helping them to navigate, figure out ways to navigate it, right? Because you're not going to be at school with your sons, and so but you give them the tools to be able to navigate the different things that they may be experiencing. And so again, figuring out ways. So, I said we have car conversations, but we also watch movies or we watch a series. So some years ago, we were watching a series called Raising Dion, and what was some different things were coming up in the show, and I would talk to my sons as they were coming up, like, "Oh, well, what would you do in this situation, or what do you think about this, and how would you handle that? Have you experienced that?" And so that opened up a an opportunity to hear some of the things that maybe they wouldn't have shared had we not been watching that show, and they were given the opportunity to further explore it, not because I'm asking them specifically directly, like we're sitting in the car and I'm like, "Hey, did such and such hit you today?" No, we're seeing it on TV because it's happening to another kid, and then it gives an opportunity for them to say, "Oh yeah, that happened to me and I did such and such," or to further explore the topic without it being so direct. So
Yeah, I love that. So we know that a lot of boys are grown up without a father, right? And I was telling one of my friend that a lot of the problems that young men, that men, one of the reasons why they show up the way that they show up, right, is because they did not have a father figure growing up. right? So what advice would you give to moms that are raising boys without a father figure in their life?
So I would say seek out mentorship. I had a colleague, and he and I were discussing. He was raised by a single mom, and what he shared with me, was that he didn't know how to be, he wasn't sure how to be a boy or just some of the things that came along with being a boy. So he would look at TV. And then later on when he went to college, he joined a fraternity just so he could have some idea of what boyhood looked like. And he said his mom just didn't trust the men around him enough to be that kind of role model or mentor in his life. And he said that he wished that she had. So, putting your sons in programs like Cub Scouts where they have an opportunity to be around men and see how men interact, putting, your sons in sports if they like sports. And maybe, I know all boys don't like sports, so that's just one thing, but like Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, putting them in mentorship programs that a lot of sororities and fraternities, I'm sorry, I said sororities, fraternities have. Um,
Yeah.
and so those are just some opportunities, but giving them an opportunity to see how men engage and interact with one another. And so that's one of the questions that I get asked often is, I'm a single mom or my their dad has passed away. What programs, what kinds of things are out there to help provide that male mentorship? And so yeah, those are questions that I get asked often. And so those are some of the things that I suggest. And then it goes even further in telling moms specifically what kinds of things to look for in mentors for their sons. So,
Yeah, I love that. Mentorship is very important, and that's one of the reasons why I want to create, like, next year. I'm planning to create like a summer boot camp for boys to give them that mentorship. Right. So your book, Strong Men Start Here, right? Give us some of the key strategies that you, other than what you have said before, right, that you outline in your book. Hello? Hello? Hello?
yes,
Oh, you went out.
yes.
Okay. All right. So I was saying that your book, Strong Men Start Here, right? Give us some of the strategies that you outline in your book other than what you have said before. Right.
So, some of the strategies that we talk about in the book, of course, we talked about communication, we talked about unraveling assumptions. One of the other things we talked about the importance of having a male role model, but one of the things that I talk about in the book too is the power of our words. I think oftentimes as moms, as maybe even dads too, we don't know or think about how powerful our words are. And I mean, there's been several movies, but I can think as one of the movies recently I was watching was the movie that Tyler Perry came out with. And so in the movie, the husband would berate his wife and just all the things. But he had a really hard childhood. And so what he was hearing in his head was all the negative things that his mom, that the people in his life had said before, but more specifically his mom. And so just knowing that what we say to our sons is so impactful. It really we can either, speak life or we can speak or death, really truly. And so we're either, speaking words of encouragement to uplift them or words to their detriment. And so our words are so powerful because as our sons continue to grow up, that reel that's playing in their head a lot of times is the things that we've said to them, the things that we've spoken into them. And so I one of the things that I really want to convey to moms, to dads is be mindful of the things that you say and be sure that you're speaking life when you're speaking into your son. So, and that kind of just goes back to, what your beliefs are. So, take the time to make sure that you are dealing with whatever, maybe traumas that you've had so that you can speak life, so that you can be aware and active so that your son becomes the kind of man that you want him to become and not the and not happen in reverse, right? You raise a son and you're like, "Oh my gosh, what happened? This is not what I envisioned for him as an adult man," but inevitably that's what happens. So the power of our words is so important. And I think the other thing that I talk about in the book is just support. As a parent supporting your son, showing up. Oftentimes I've heard boys say, they're playing at a game, or maybe they're at a recital and their parents aren't there, and they're like, "Oh, it's okay because, they're working," or things like that. But really, really, they want you there. And so your support, and if you can't be there, sending somebody in your place, to cheer them on, to encourage them, to support them, because they need that kind of support. And I think oftentimes when it comes to boys, parents think when their sons get to a certain age that they don't need that support, and they do. And even if they're saying that it's okay, they still need it and they still want it. So those are
Yeah,
some.
yeah, I totally agree, especially the power of words, right? And that's one of the reasons why I always tell my son that I love him. And one of the things that I plan to do when he gets older is like have these affirmations. He's 2 years old now, so he can't really repeat them. But I'm always like speaking life over him, telling him that he's going to be great. He's
Yes.
yeah, right. So words of affirmation are very important, right? Because I did not have that growing up, and it took me years of psychology, right? It's a good thing that, and that's one of the reasons why I entered into this field, right? Life coaching and studying psychology and all of those things, right? Because of my own experience, like all of the negative words, and it took me years just to unravel and to start healing from a lot of the words that were spoken over my life, right? So you can
Mhm.
speak a word to your child like um just a simple word when a child is 5 years old, and it can take that child 20, 30 years just to heal from that.
Yes.
And so yeah, that's very important, the power of your words. So I would encourage every dads, right? Every moms to start speaking speaking words of important words over your child, and having your child repeat them, have that like a mantra, like maybe in the morning before they go to school and in the evenings, like before they go to bed, right? Have them speak those words, right? Because what you say to a child, that child will always like repeat it. So oftentimes we hear we as adults say things like, "My mom said this," or "My dad told me
Right.
this." Right? Because what you say is so important, and they will hold on to that,
Absolutely.
right? And so, for you, how does faith or spirituality helps boys grow into confident and passionate men?
Um, so faith is huge. It's a part, it's a part of me, and so it's also a part of my sons. And so it kind of governs, how we do things. And right now, I'm doing a 40-day prayer challenge, and I've, encouraged my sons to do the same thing. And so not only just talking about living out our faith, but also showing them. So, there are things that I've done, and I've stepped out on faith. And so I'm bringing them along the journey so they can see what this looks like in action. And so it's an integral part of how we live our lives, how we are raising our sons, and the kind of men that we want them to become. And so, what's and so that's it's kind of filtered in everything we do. I've mentioned the 5-minute devotional that we do on our way to school in the morning. I incorporate prayer in the morning on our way to school, and not just me praying, but them praying as well. Um, they're part of different youth activities, at our church. They see me working at church, doing volunteering and doing different things. And so they in turn do the same. And so I live by the mantra that I practice what I preach, because oftentimes kids don't do what you say, they do what you do. And so it's important for me to model to them, um, the things that I want them to do as well. So,
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember seeing what like I had a neighbor, right, and her son was, I think it was her son was about 4 years old at that time, and her father would always smoke around him, and so oftentimes I would catch him like smoking paper, right, because that's what he saw his dad doing. So like your kids, especially boys, they're always watching you at
yeah.
the yeah. So I just have about two more questions for you.
Sure.
Um, what are some of the biggest parenting myths you have to clear up?
Um, so one of them, the biggest one, especially in terms of raising boys, is that boys don't cry, or boys don't feel the same way as girls.
Yeah,
Um, boys are not as sensitive as girls, or boys are not sensitive at all. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine, and she was surprised. I think I may have mentioned that one of my sons was sensitive, or felt
yeah,
a certain way, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't think boys were sensitive." And I'm thinking, boys are human, right? They're no
exactly.
different, right? And so I think there has been this. So when we talk about debunking myths, I think the largest one is that boys aren't human, right? They don't have the same emotions and feelings that women do, or whatever. And so I think that's the biggest myth to debunk, is that boys are human and they feel the same way. They often don't express it, but they have the same feelings. So,
Yeah, I remember there was this young man that he was working and he got his foot, one of his foot, like cut off or damaged, and he
mm,
was crying, and the men around him were laughing at him because he and saying that because they were saying men should not cry, and I'm saying like this is a man that won't have the probably won't have the use of one of his legs, right? Of course, and he's in pain. Of course, he's going to cry,
right.
man. So in what advice would you, as we close out this interview, right? What advice would you give to parents in raising boys?
So the biggest piece of advice I would give to parents raising sons is to it all starts with you. And so take time and ask yourself, what are your beliefs? What are your assumptions? And do you want to carry those beliefs and assumptions? Um, do you want to keep those, or do you want to make changes? The beliefs and the assumptions and the stereotypes maybe that you have about boys, do you want to keep them, or do you want to do something different? Because it's hard to do things that are opposite, meaning you say you want your son to be this kind of man, but you believe something that's contrary to that. And so it's hard to raise a son that is emotionally whole and confident and happy, but you don't believe that men are good people, or they can be good, or they can do good things. And so as parents, I want to encourage you to do the work within yourself, ask yourself the hard questions, and then take small steps to make changes, so that your sons don't grow up feeling those assumptions and those stereotypes, and that you really give them the room and the freedom to be who they can be and who God has created them to be.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. If someone wants to get in touch with you or want to grab a copy of your book, where can they find it?
So my website is www.richellewhitaker.com. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. _Richelle. I'm on my YouTube at Dr. Richelle. Yeah, so any of those places you can find me. And I also have a podcast called Raising Sons. So wherever you are able to get podcasts, you can find my podcast.